All right, now we're in business. All right, so now that we're done with adding and subtracting, multiplying and dividing decimals, okay? That's not something that's going to go away though. Just because we finish a chapter or a standard doesn't mean we can forget about how to do that stuff. So you will still see it pop up in warm-ups, okay? And it will still pop up in all math that you do, all right? But what we're moving on to now is in chapter 2, dealing with decimals, fractions, and percents. So the standard that we're covering now, you can see at the bottom of this screen, or I always hang them over on the south wall, is 6NS5. And here's what it says, and I'll explain exactly what that means. It says you will know commonly used fractions and their decimal and percent equivalents. Meaning, when given a fraction, you should be able to change it to a decimal to a percent. When given a percent, you should be able to change it to a decimal or a fraction. Okay? When given a decimal, you should be able to change it to a fraction or a percent. Okay? So if you notice on the standard, it says you'll be able to convert between any of those with positive numbers without the use of a calculator. Okay, we still are not using calculators. So those of you that choose to on your work are going to struggle when you're given a test or iLearn. We're not using calculators yet. We'll get there eventually. Okay, so I'm breaking this up into separate lessons just to make sure we understand it. So first thing we're going to look at is writing a decimal as a fraction. So if you are given a decimal, you should be able to write it as a fraction. And it's actually pretty simple as long as we understand one thing. First thing you have to understand in order to write decimals as fractions is how to read a number. Okay, so the first thing we're going to go over is place value. I find the easiest way to write a place value chart is to turn your paper going this way because we're going to write the name of each place value below it. Okay, now obviously we are not doing all place values because they go on into infinity. Okay, we're not doing all of them, but we will do a few. So again, this is going to be place value. If you can read a decimal, you can write it as a fraction. All right. So we have our decimal point. Then we are going to go 4 spaces to the left of the decimal. And then we will discuss 5 spaces to the right of the decimal. Here's what I want you to remember. When you are going to the left of the decimal, these are your whole numbers. Okay, so our numbers bigger than 0. 1, 50, 1,000, 530, those are all whole numbers. So those are all to the left of your decimal point. When you go to the right of your decimal point, these are when our numbers get really, really small. So these are our decimal numbers. Okay, so on a number line, the further we move to the left, the bigger we get. The further we move to the right, the smaller we get. Okay, now, usually we remember our place value going to the left, or to the, yes, the left. And then I'm going to show you how easy it is. As long as you know your place value to the left, you can easily figure out your place value to the right. Okay, so our first space to the left of the decimal on our whole number side. Anyone remember which place value that is? Mateo? That is your ones. Yes. Okay, this is place value. What comes after our ones? Typically, these are ones we remember. Leah? The tens. After tens? Jordan? Hundreds. And then the last one we're doing, definitely not the last one that exists. Last one we're doing, John? Thousands. Absolutely. Oops. Sorry, that's an S at the end and nothing. My mistake. Now it goes on forever. 10,000, 100,000, and so forth. Okay, but that's as far as we're going to talk about at least today. So, if you know these, whether you realize it or not, you know all of the decimals to the right. Okay. The only place value we do not have the same on our decimal side is ones. The rest of them fall in the same order, except they have a magic THS on the end of them. Okay. There are no ones. That doesn't exist. Everything else matches as you go to the right. Okay. So if there are no ones, what is this first place value to the right of the decimal point going to be? It mirrors the other side. Mason? Yep. So we're going to have 10. And then since we are on the decimal side, there's a THS on the end. So it's actually the tenths. It mirrors exactly what goes on the whole number side. There are just no ones. We start with tenths. Then, again, if we're mirroring, what is our next place value going to be on our decimal side? Scarlett? Hundredths. Yes. So you have 100 with the THS on the end of it. Okay. And then again, if we're mirroring, what would come next? Mateo? Thousandths. So you have thousand, THOU, SAND. And then since this is a decimal, it's THS. Thousandths. Okay. Now I didn't continue on our whole number side, but we should still be able to figure these out. What would come after 1,000 on the whole number side still comes after on the decimal side. So what would come after thousandths? James? 10 thousandths. So you have 10,000 with a THS. And then again, it just mirrors the other side. So after 10 thousandths, what would come next? Mateo? Yep. 100,000 with a THS. So you've got 100, HUN, DR, ED, and then thousandths. TH, OU, SA, ND, and then your THS. Okay, so your THS is a clue that you're dealing with a number less than 1. Okay, it is a small number. It's on the decimal side. They mirror each other. There's just no ones. Questions about place value, because you have to understand that in order to write a decimal as a fraction. If you can read a decimal, you can very easily write it as a fraction. Any questions about place value before we move on? Anyone still need this chart? I'm going to turn it the other direction. Okay. All right. So now what we're going to look at is what it takes to write a decimal as a fraction. Okay. Basically, you just have to know how to read it. All right. So we've got 2 steps. I'm going to go through these. Very first thing you need to do is read the number as it's written. So that's the first thing you're going to do is just read the number as it's written. And we'll do examples, so don't worry if the word explanation doesn't make a ton of sense yet. It will. Then the important part is, then you will find the place value of the last number. So then find the place value of the last number. So to write it as a fraction, all fractions have 2 numbers. Who remembers what the top number is called in a fraction? Ayanna? Give it a shot. Super close. If you heard what she said, that might help you. What is the top number of a fraction called? James? Numerator. So in a fraction, we have 2 numbers. Top number is a numerator. And what's our bottom number called? Denominator. See, you got it. So when we change our decimal to a fraction, we have to have a numerator. We have to have a denominator. So now we just have to know where in the world we get those numbers from. Okay? Your numerator is just simply the number as you read it. Okay? So it is the number that you read. And this will make sense in a second. READ, not RED. So it's the numerator is just the number that you read. And the denominator is the place value of the last number. So the denominator is the place value of the last number. And I'm going to teach you a shortcut. This symbol stands for number in math, okay? In science, it'll stand for pound. If you're on social media, it's a hashtag. But in math, that stands for number. So instead of writing out the word number, I can just use that symbol. So your denominator is the place value of the last number. Then there is one thing you need to pay attention to. And we'll go over this in our examples. If there is a number before the decimal point, that is the whole number of your fraction. So in your decimal, if there is a whole number, before the decimal point, that is your whole number of your fraction. So that is your whole number of your fraction. And again, I'm going to use my symbol so I don't have to write out the word. And then we're going to do 4 examples. I will say this many times. If you can read a decimal, you will always be able to write it as a fraction. So you have to know your place value. If you don't know your place value, you will not be able to read a decimal. Therefore, you'll have no clue what it is as a fraction. So we have to know our place value. Therefore, we can read decimals and we can easily write them as fractions. I'm going to turn my page, but those notes are on the new line board. Okay, so we're going to do 4 examples following those steps. Now, on your IXLs that you are going to do, you will eventually have to type out a decimal as it would be in words. That's just like saying it. So we're going to practice writing these 4 also. That way I can point out a few things that you have to be careful of when you actually type out a word or a decimal. So first one we're going to do is this. I'm not going to say it because that's part of this. When you're reading a decimal, if there is no number before the decimal point, the very first thing you're going to do is ignore all of it. Okay? Every one of you can read that number. All right? That's the first part. Read the number as it's written. What number is that? Mateo? Well, this part. Slow down for me. One step backwards. What number is that? Perfect. Okay? Read the number. That's just 3. Second part is figuring out what place value the last digit is in. Well, this one only has 1 digit, so you're looking at the only number there. And Mateo, what place value is that 3 in? Tenths. So that would be written as 3/10. Now, if I covered all of that up and asked you to write the fraction 3/10, I'm sure most of you could do it. But then when you see it like this or you see it like this, now we're all confused. Okay? Don't let words and numbers confuse you. You guys know how to write fractions. You've been doing fractions since probably 3rd grade. So, to write this as a fraction, obviously you need a fraction bar. Now, when you're typing fractions, whether it's in IXL or in Canvas, there's not, like, you don't use the horizontal line. That's more of a hyphen. When you're typing fractions, you use the backslash, and I'll point this out in a minute when we get into Canvas. But the backslash is with your question mark key, okay? But I'll point that out again once we get in our computers. So, numerator is the number that you read. That's this part. Denominator is the place value. It's that simple. Numerator is the number. Denominator is the place value. So it would be 3/10. Okay? Questions about that? How I went from a decimal to a fraction. If you can read it, you can write it. If you can't read it, you're going to have to work on it. Right? Let's do this. Again, I'm not going to read it because that's what we're working on. So again, there is no number in front of the decimal. So we're going to ignore all of that. Someone besides Mateo, how do we read that number? You've been reading that number since at least first grade. Justin? Yes. Now here's the tricky part when you write a number like 25. If you are typing it into something, you would have 20. Anytime a word ends in TY and it has another number coming after it, you have to have a hyphen and then the next word with no spaces. So it would be 20-5. Always a hyphen if it ends in TY. No spaces. So that's our number. We read the number as it was written. Now we have to find the place value of our last digit. This is why we wrote a place value chart. What place value is that 5 in? Aubrey, what were you thinking? Remember, I always say I'd rather you think and be wrong than not think at all. Hundreds. Perfect. So it would be 25 hundredths. It's 100 with a THS. So that's how it would be written out. Then, to write as a fraction, your numerator is your number, 25. Your denominator is your place value, 100. 25 hundredths. 25 hundredths. You do not have to reduce. Okay, now if you're just used to doing that, obviously you can, but for iLearn, you do not have to reduce any fractions, so we're not requiring you to reduce any fractions. So you could leave this as 25 hundredths. Technically, it's 1/4, but you do not have to reduce fractions. So you can leave it as 25 hundredths, which actually makes it a lot simpler. All right, next one. Okay, again, I'm not going to say it because that's the whole point. Nothing before the decimal point, so we can ignore it. How would we read this? And a lot of people throw a little word in here that we don't need. Jordan? Yes, don't throw the and in there. So how would you read that? 375. Now, a lot of people, and I think it's just because it comes out naturally, will say 375 because it just like flows. The and after 100 does not go in a word answer. So this would be 300. -5 all together. $375. Then you just have to find the place value of your last digit. If you don't know, you can look at your chart. What is the third space to the right of our decimal point? James? Thousandths. Yes. I'm going to put it below just so I have room. So 375 thousandths. It's all based on the place value of that last digit. Then someone tell me what that would be as a fraction. You have your number as your numerator, your place value is your denominator. And I actually kind of wrote it that way when I did it in words. Mason, what would we have?
375.
Perfect. Over 1,000. And again, you don't have to reduce it. That's the nice part. Questions on that before I throw a whole number in there? The number that you read is your numerator. Your place value is your denominator. All right, then let's do, I'm going to make this one a little tricky. Okay, now with this one, we have a number before the decimal point. I've pointed this out before, but just as a reminder, when there is a number before a decimal point, you do not read a decimal point as point. What word do we say for the decimal point? It's not 2 point. Dominic? What's that? When we write it as a fraction, yes. But when we're just reading this as a decimal, James, it's and. Okay? So you would read the number before, 2. Then you have and. Okay? So that's how this would start. 2 and. Now we can ignore everything before. This one's a little trickier. How do you read that number? And don't let the 0 confuse you. Justin? That's just 5. Okay? Whether there's 1 0 or 100 zeros before it, that is still just the number 5. Now the tricky part comes into play. What is the place value of the 5? It is the second place after the decimal point. So what is the place value of that 5? Mateo? It's hundredths, yes. It is not tenths. So that would be 2 and 5 hundredths. Then, when you go to write this as a fraction, now, when you go to write this as a fraction, this is that little specialty thing that I talked about. When you have a number in front of the decimal point, you now have a mixed number, okay? Mixed number has a whole number and a fraction. So this 2 becomes the whole number of your fraction. Anytime there is a number before the decimal point, that becomes a mixed number now, where you have a whole number and a fraction. Okay, you can see there's a difference. These 3 had zeros, so there was nothing before them. This one has a 2, so you have to have a 2 before the fraction. All right. Then the rest is the same. Your number is your numerator. Your place value is your denominator. So what was our number? 5. Not 0, 5, just 5. And what was our place value? 100. 2 and 5 hundredths. When you go to type a mixed number into IXL, into Canvas, into iLearn, here is how it would be typed. You would do the 2, then you have to have a space. Then you would type the 5 and the 100. But anytime you're typing a mixed number, there has to be a space between the whole number and the beginning of the fraction. Okay? You have to have a space there when you're typing. Any questions? Okay. You're not going to do your assignment actually in your book, but I want to look at it in your book first. So in your textbook, I want you guys to turn to page 93.